welcome back to Driveway. Today we're going to talk a little bit about dialing in a bellhousing and why you actually need to do it on these modern drivelines. So, basically we want to start off, what is dialing in your bellhousing? That is pretty much, of course you got the dial indicator, but you're basically going to make sure that your bellhousing is lined up properly to get your transmission and the crankshaft all in a perfect line. So, it's like no matter where you go online, you'll hear people say you just take this stuff and throw it all together, because these days everything is built with precision, which is true to a point. So let's just go hypothetically that no matter what you're building, you're allowed let's just go 5/1000ths variance. So that's 5/1000ths of an inch. That's very minuscule. That would be probably the thickness of a couple sheets of paper. So as you think about that, that is a very tight tolerance. But you're going to have to think that all of these components have been put in to the machine by a human, which they can have rough days, they can have a day that they just don't give a crap about their job, and you can just have the machine itself with worn out tools machining a little bit off as well. And even to mark it up even more is, even if you're within your 5/1000ths tolerance for each of your section, if you happen to have 5/1000ths tolerance on the block and crank, and an additional 5/1000ths on the bellhousing, and then an additional 5/1000ths on the transmission, then we end up with, if it all ends up on the same side, you could have a good 15/1000ths off. And while it wasn't a huge deal back in the old days, like the 70s Ford I have outside, that transmission has kind of more of a roller ball bearing main shaft, which allows it to actually wiggle a little bit, and it relies on the pilot bushing in the back of the crank to finish locating it and keeping it where it belongs. On these, we have a taper bearing, so that shaft is held right in where it needs to be. It doesn't allow much movement at all, so you need a lot less run out. Also, to add to that, these LS motors and a lot of the newer ones went to that bearing style pilot bushing. I've got one over there that I got with the Monster clutch, but if you've ever seen anyone complaining that their pilot bushing has blown out and that GM makes crap and you can't trust them and you have to go put in a bronze bushing or something like that, then chances are their whole drive line is not aligned properly, because that little bearing in there should have very little to do with anything, and you shouldn't really fry it unless you got some weird wibbly wobblies. So that's going to bring me to this QuickTime bellhousing. So if you look online, they always say, many places from one end to the other, they say that QuickTime, which I believe is a Holley product, that their tooling is within 1/1000ths, so you never have to measure it. As true as that might be, you also have to think that there's powder coat on this thing. So even if you got it measured perfectly, that powder coat could be uneven. And then you have to think about, did the factory LS, did they bore the line hone correctly for the crankshaft? And were the pins put in correctly in the transmission? So that's why it's imperative to measure up your bell housing. Now on this particular one, I decided to measure its flatness first, and that would be measuring this whole face of the bell housing to make sure that it's completely perpendicular to the face of the crankshaft. So that way we have a much flatter surface to go off of to bolt the transmission onto. That, and when you go to align the circle, if it's at a little bit of an angle, your circle can be slightly off as well. So, what I ended up having to do is I was a couple thousandths high on the bottom of the bell housing versus the top. So I was pretty much 0 all up here, and then down there I was in 5 to 6 thousandths. So all that I did was below the dowel pins, I just ground the powder coat off of the bell housing. When I logged that thing back up on there, we were within 2, maybe 3 thousandths at the most. I want to say it was actually like 2.5 at the furthest down. So that's a much better position to be at, and it also makes it so we don't have to like shim things out, because in the old days you used to have the big piece of the metal with shim, just not a good thing. But once we got that flattened out, I decided that I'm not going to trust that the QuickTime flange here was perfectly centered. So I just took the front plate off the T56 Magnum and bolted and torqued it down onto the bell housing. That allowed me to put in the dial indicator, and as you saw at the beginning of the video, you just rotate it around and mark down the measurements at decent intervals. But yeah, essentially this video would be me doing all of this measuring and getting the transmission hooked onto it and being done for the day. But when I got in the middle of measuring, I had 0 down here. I am off 9 thousandths at this point. I am off 12 thousandths here, and then what was that? I'm off 4 thousandths down here. So that means is I need to get a couple offset dowel pins. So since I'm off 12 here, you divide that in half. That means it needs to go 6 thousandths that direction. But since all they make is 7 thousandths and bigger, we're going to have to make sure we rotate it a little bit so we can get that 6 that way, and hopefully we can get like maybe 2 this way. So we just take the dowel pins and point it a little bit that way and hope for the best. It should get us pretty darn close and within the 5 thousandths that somewhere Tremec says you're supposed to have on these things. It's really difficult to get any information out of them. You email them and they just send you to like the QuickTime video of measuring your bell housing, which doesn't help you one darn bit when you ask for specific specs, because they won't really tell you that you need to be within 5 thousandths, 10 thousandths, whether what has to be. It's kind of ridiculous, but that is the nature of the stuff. So we'll just go with as close as we can and figure we're better off than just slapping it together. So hopefully with all this extra time, which equates to about a week worth of mess around, measuring, torquing, measuring some more, dying of heat stroke, going in the house, you know, the usual stuff. So that's essentially what I've been doing this whole week. My dowel pin should be arriving Monday, Tuesday, somewhere in there. So then I can get that on there and bolt all the rest of the clutch back in there as well. That way we can move along. We'll probably have to mess around with the throwout bearing and that type of stuff. Get it in the car, hook it up to the current clutch that's in there. Lots of stuff to do, but we're kind of coming down that kind of stretch where you can start seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. Because once we have the engine transmission mounted back in there, we're pretty much go for just running wires, getting an ECU, and plugging hoses, and we're ready to fire this thing. So we're pretty much on track, since I've mentioned before that the goal is to get this thing fired up before winter, and then we'll spend winter getting a lot of this stuff ironed back out. You know, whether we're going to paint or not paint, different wheels, maybe brakes, springs, and definitely we'll have to get the drive shaft and axle shafts made up. So hopefully in that winter when things are a little bit slower, the drive shaft companies can hook me up with some gear here. Depending on how things go, I might end up just trailering the whole thing down to like Kansas, where G-Force is at, and see if they can build something. I don't know, I haven't really entertained that too much. But essentially, that's what I've been doing this week. Make sure you stick around so we can see this thing roll out, do a couple burnouts, and take out a crowd or two. Anyways, thanks for stopping by and watching, and I'll see you all later.